Hey guys, I want to finish up with you today. This passage from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10 about Paul and the thorn, and the statement where Jesus says, "My grace is sufficient for you." You know, I've heard that most of my life, and it's true, but in what context was that used? When did the Lord say that to Paul? It's when he had asked him 3 times to remove this thorn, this thing that irritated him, that God wanted to use in his life to make him more like Jesus, to refine him and teach him how to trust, really trust the Lord. And he says, "My grace is sufficient for you." He says in verse 9, he says, and he said to me, is what Paul says, "My grace is sufficient for you," what the Lord told him, "for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I rather boast about my weakness, so the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I'm well content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, with persecution and difficulties, for Christ's sake. When I am weak, then I am made strong." Boy, that's something we need to understand, and we need to grab a hold of it. When I'm weak, then he makes us strong. It's in our weaknesses that his strength is manifested. And oftentimes we won't admit that we're weak. What we've looked at is that Paul realized there was a problem, and he admitted it. It was a thorn in the flesh. He prayed. He asked God to remove it. God chose not to. And we talked about how do I respond when God says no. And last time we talked about the purpose, that Paul understood the purpose of the thorn. It was to keep him from bragging about himself. And that because he had seen some stuff, experienced some stuff nobody else had. And oftentimes the same thing with us, man. The more we grow, the more God reveals to us of himself, the more he uses us, there will always be a temptation for us to take credit for it. So oftentimes God allows things to come into our life that refine us, that keep us from exalting ourselves. The last thing in this series I want to share with you is that Paul experienced his power. You see, it was in his power becomes greatest in our problems. His power become more evident in our weakness. He looked at, but this is what Jesus says, "My grace is enough for you." Have you realized that? That the grace of God really is enough? Man, I've been walking through something with a friend of mine where a very difficult situation, and we've talked about this over and over again, that that his response has been completely different than what I expected. And it's all because of the grace of God being sufficient, the grace of God being enough, and the power of God becoming evident in a person's weakness. And that's what we see here, that my grace is enough, my grace is sufficient, my grace is able, my grace is strong enough, because my power has absolutely no limit. The power of God is achieving, the power of God is capable, the power of God knows absolutely no limits. The word perfected here comes from a word that it reaches in its intended goal. It does what it's supposed to do. The grace of God does what it's supposed to do. The power of God does exactly what is intended for it to do. And in our weakness, when we have no strength, when we're absolutely powerless, that's when the power of God can be seen the most. That's when it's manifested the most. I've shared this with you before. One of the guys that mentored me said this over and over again to me. "Wayne, you got to realize I can't." He never said I could, but he can, and he always said he would. Man, I was reminded of that as I was studying this passage, that when Paul says, look, this is what Jesus said to me, "My grace is sufficient, for power is perfected in weakness." I can't pray, but praise God, he can and he will. And look what he says in the rest of this passage. He says, look, I'm going to take pleasure. I'm going to take pleasure in weakness. Why? Because that's when the power of Christ can dwell in me and can be manifested in me and be seen in me. And that's when he gets the most glory. And one of the things I've noticed about us is that we often don't like to admit our weaknesses. You know, especially as men, that we oftentimes try to cover up our weaknesses. We've got to realize that it's when I realize I can't and understand that He can. So that's what this Christian life is about. It's about me coming to the point of realizing I can't save myself, but praise God, He can. I can't live the Christian life the way it's intended for me to live, but praise God, Him living in me and through me, He can do what I'm incapable of doing myself. His power can be manifested in our life when we admit that we can't. Paul goes on and he says, I'm content. I'm content in my weaknesses. I'm content with my thorn. You know, there will be insults. There will be times that I'm treated shamefully. I'm okay with that. There will be distresses. There will be offenses. There will be afflictions in my life. I'm okay with that. There will be persecution. There will be hostility. There will be people that come against me, and I'm okay with that. There will be difficulties. There will be troubles. There will be hard days. There will be hard times. There will be extremely difficult situations, but I'm okay with that. Why? Because for Christ's sake, when I am weak, then I am made strong. When I can't, I realize He can. When I'm weak, His strength can be manifested in and through my life. You see, even in our thorn, the power of God can be manifested if we will admit that we have a thorn. If we will cry out to Him and we will allow Him to use that thorn for my good and for His purpose. You see, because oftentimes we think that victory is me overcoming a situation like this. An irritation or a thorn. Victory is not me overcoming my thorn. Victory is not me overcoming my difficulty. Victory is me allowing Jesus to overcome me. You see, Paul experienced the power of God because he was willing to accept the grace of God and realize that in his weakness, that the power of God will make him strong. I pray that you'll realize that. I pray that these past few weeks that God's spoken to your heart through this passage, that yes, Paul had a thorn. It was something that irritated him. Not sure what it was. I don't know what yours is, but you probably got one. He cried out. He asked God to remove it. God chose not to. You may have too. God may have chosen not to remove your thorn, but understand it has a purpose, and that purpose is to refine us. That purpose is for my good and for the glory of God. And I need to experience the power of God in my life like Paul did. And I do that when I understand that His grace is sufficient, and it's in our weakness that His power is manifested in and through our life. Go let Jesus be Jesus in you today, and have a blessed day. And I pray God has used this passage to speak to your heart. Go let His power become evident in your life. You can't. He never said you could. He can, and He always said that He would. Thank you so much for watching Complete in Christ as we strive to teach you about the Christ life. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and may you have a blessed day walking with Jesus.